The first time I noticed something strange was when I woke up in the middle of the night. I had been staying in the cabin for about a week, trying to escape the noise of city life. The cabin, a small wooden structure tucked away in the woods, was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. It had no electricity or running water, just a fireplace, some basic furniture, and a small kitchen. The outside world felt miles away, and that was exactly what I wanted. But something wasn't right. The cabin was in a remote area, several miles off the nearest paved road. I had rented it from a website, and the description made it seem like a perfect spot for solitude and reflection. There were no neighbors for miles. At first, I thought the isolation would be a welcome change, a chance to clear my head. But now, in the dead of night, I wasn't so sure. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up, suddenly wide awake for no reason. The room was cold, and the faint sound of wind rustling outside made the old cabin creak. I thought I'd heard something else too, like a distant thud, but I brushed it off as nothing. It wasn't uncommon for the cabin to groan and shift during the night. It was old, after all. The wooden beams had been there for decades, and the place had its quirks. I had noticed some of them the first day I arrived, but it didn't bother me at first. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned as if they were reaching out to touch the cabin. It was an eerie sound, but I knew it was just the wind. I tried to go back to sleep, but my mind wouldn't settle. Instead, I found myself staring at the window, where the shadows of the trees outside stretched long across the glass. There was a full moon that night, and the light was almost too bright. I sat up in bed, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was something off about the way the trees moved. They were swaying too much, almost like they were shaking. But I knew that wasn't possible, not with just a gust of wind. I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the dark woods. The moonlight illuminated the area around the cabin, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in the wind. The more I looked, the more uneasy I became. There was a strange feeling in the air, something I couldn't put my finger on. I stepped back from the window and rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the feeling. My instincts were telling me something was wrong, but I didn't know what. I walked over to the fireplace and stoked the embers, hoping the warmth would calm my nerves. But the cabin didn't feel like it had the same charm anymore. The peace I had hoped to find here had been replaced by an unsettling stillness, like the entire place was holding its breath. It wasn't just the wind or the trees, it was something deeper, something in the air. I couldn't explain it, but it was there, and it made my skin crawl. I decided to get out of bed and check the front door, thinking maybe I had left it unlocked or something. The door was heavy, solid wood, with old brass hinges that squeaked whenever you turned the handle. I walked through the small living room, past the worn armchair and the wooden dining table, until I reached the door. When I opened it, the night air hit me hard. It was colder than it had been earlier, and the wind seemed to be picking up again, howling through the trees. I stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind me. The gravel path that led to the cabin was barely visible in the moonlight, and the woods seemed darker than usual. I stood there for a few minutes, just breathing in the cool air and listening to the sounds of the forest. It was then that I heard it, a faint rustling noise coming from the trees. At first, I thought it was just an animal moving through the underbrush, but the sound didn't stop. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but too light and too deliberate. I froze. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the noise. It wasn't like any animal I knew. The footsteps didn't sound right, too purposeful. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one out here. I was sure of it. I turned back toward the cabin, feeling a cold sweat begin to form on the back of my neck. Something was definitely wrong. I was out in the middle of nowhere, alone, and now I was hearing things that shouldn't be there. I quickly unlocked the door and stepped back inside, bolting it behind me. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just overreacting. The wind was playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The cabin had always felt safe before, but now it felt different, felt watched. I spent the rest of the night lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds around me. The wind, the rustling of the trees, the occasional creak of the wood settling. It was all normal, or so I told myself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. The next day, I tried to put it behind me. I spent the day outside, chopping wood for the fire and exploring the area around the cabin. The sun was out, and the woods were peaceful, too peaceful almost. The birds were quiet. The usual sounds of nature seemed muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I thought it was just my imagination, and by the time evening rolled around, I convinced myself I was being silly. But that night, it happened again. I woke up suddenly, in the same way I had the night before. The cold, the silence, the feeling of being watched. It was all there. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I got out of bed and walked over to the window again, looking out into the darkness. The moon was still full, casting a silvery glow across the trees. But this time, something was different. There, in the distance, I saw movement. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it looked like a figure moving between the trees, just on the edge of the clearing. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but it was gone before I could focus on it. My heart raced in my chest. That wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too human. I felt a cold rush of fear sweep over me, and I stepped back from the window, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay another night in this place. Whatever it was, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I grabbed my things quickly, my jacket, my keys, my phone, and ran to the door. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. I just wanted to leave. But when I opened the door, I froze. There, standing in the doorway, was a person. A tall, thin man, dressed in dark clothes, standing motionless just outside the cabin. His face was obscured by shadow, and he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off him. His presence was suffocating, like he was pulling the life out of the air around him. I was frozen, unable to move or speak. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared into the woods, blending into the darkness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hands still on the door handle. My mind was racing, but my body was paralyzed by fear. After a long time, I finally snapped out of it. I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it as if it could protect me. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, wide awake, listening for any sound, any movement, but nothing came. The woods were silent again. By morning, I was done. I couldn't stay another minute in that cabin. I packed up everything I could and drove back to the nearest town, my heart still racing, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I never saw the man again, but I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. I've never gone back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure. There was something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't have been, and it was waiting for me. I woke up early that morning, the sun not quite up yet, just that pale light creeping in through the cracks in the cabin walls. I always liked getting up before the sun. It felt like I had a moment of peace to myself, a time when everything was still quiet, before the world started to buzz. The cabin was small, tucked away in a remote part of the woods. My plan had been to spend the weekend here, alone, to disconnect and find some peace. The silence outside was always comforting, but there was something else to it as well, something unsettling. Maybe it was just the isolation or the fact that I hadn't really spent much time in this place since I'd bought it. It wasn't much, just a one-room cabin with a small kitchen and a wood stove, but it was mine. The solitude felt like a welcome change at first, but now, as I pulled myself out of bed and rubbed the sleep out of my eyes, I felt a sense of unease. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. It had been a long drive to get here, and I hadn't planned on staying for long, but the quiet had a way of settling in your bones. The cabin sat on a stretch of land far from any real neighbors, the kind of place where you couldn't hear anything except the wind and the occasional animal. The night before had been calm. Too calm, maybe. I'd eaten a simple dinner of canned soup, sat by the fire for a bit, and then gone to bed early. It had felt nice, too nice, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But now, standing in the dim light of early morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I walked over to the stove and stoked the fire, adding a few more logs. The warmth from the flames spread through the small room, and I stood there for a while, just watching the fire crackle and dance. The cabin was still, the only sound being the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the wooden beams. After a moment, I grabbed my jacket from the hook near the door and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that nipped at your skin but wasn't unbearable. The ground was damp from the previous night's rain, and I could see my breath as I exhaled. I took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill my lungs, and began walking toward the edge of the clearing where the trees grew thick. It was still early, and the woods were quiet. No birds yet, no animals moving, just the stillness of nature. I walked for a while, trying to push the unease out of my mind, focusing on the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. The woods here were thick, the trees tall and dense, their branches creating a canopy overhead that blocked out much of the sky. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, but I tried to ignore it. It was just the woods. They had a way of making you feel small, insignificant, like you were at the mercy of something bigger than you. As I walked, I noticed the ground getting softer, the mud more pronounced. I stepped carefully, trying not to slip, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more I noticed something strange. The air had shifted. It wasn't just cold anymore. It had a damp, earthy smell to it, like something had been left out to rot. I glanced around, but there was nothing in sight. No animals, no sounds. It was just wrong. I turned around to head back to the cabin, but that's when I heard it. A soft crack, like something large snapping a branch underfoot. I froze, my heart racing. I didn't know what it was, but the noise came from behind me. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anything unusual. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. They were common around here, though you didn't usually see them during the day. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started walking faster, trying to get back to the cabin, but the air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me. My footsteps seemed louder in the silence of the woods, and I couldn't help but feel like something was following me, keeping pace just behind. I picked up the pace, walking faster, then jogging, my breath coming in short bursts. My feet slipped in the mud, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to the cabin, to that small, familiar space. I could hear the sound of branches breaking, twigs snapping, now definitely closer. It was like something was following me, moving through the woods just as fast, but staying hidden, just out of sight. Finally, I broke through the tree line, seeing the cabin in the distance. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted toward it. I didn't even stop to close the door behind me as I bolted inside, locking it quickly. I stood there, panting, listening. I could hear nothing but my own breathing, loud and ragged in the quiet of the cabin. I moved to the window, pulling back the curtains just enough to see outside. The clearing was empty, no movement, nothing at all. But that feeling remained, the one that told me I wasn't alone. Something was out there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach. I spent the rest of the day in the cabin, pacing around, looking out the windows, trying to stay busy. Every creak of the wood or rustle outside made me jump. Couldn't relax. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was out there, waiting. As the sun started to set, I knew I couldn't stay here another night. The unease had grown into something more, a gut feeling that I couldn't ignore. I had to leave. I grabbed my things, packed up as quickly as I could, and made my way to the door. But when I opened it, I froze. There, standing in the clearing, was a figure, tall, cloaked in shadow, barely visible in the fading light. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel the presence. It wasn't a person. It was something else. I slammed the door shut, locking it again, my heart pounding in my chest. I stepped back, unsure what to do. Should I stay inside? Should I try to make a run for it? I could still hear the faint crack of branches, the distant sound of something moving, but it was far away now, maybe gone. I grabbed the rifle I had stashed by the door, just in case, and moved back to the window. The figure was gone. The clearing was empty again, but I didn't trust it. Couldn't. I waited, standing by the window, my hands shaking around the rifle. Time passed slowly, the shadows lengthening as the night deepened. Hours later, when the darkness had fully set in, I couldn't stay any longer. The fear was too much. I grabbed what I needed and bolted out of the door, making a break for the car. I didn't look back, not even once, until I was safely inside, the engine roaring to life as I sped away. I didn't look back when I left the cabin behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching, waiting for the next person who dared to enter its domain. And I wasn't going to be that person again. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it a month later, never speaking about the strange events that had happened. People could say whatever they wanted. I knew what I felt, what I experienced. But the woods have a way of keeping their secrets, and some things are better left undisturbed. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months. The idea of getting away from everything, leaving behind the noise, the crowds, and just sinking into the quiet of nature was something I craved. The place I had booked was tucked deep in a forest, far away from any neighbors. No phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just me, the trees, and the silence. Perfect. I drove up there in the early afternoon, the sun still high in the sky. My car bounced over the dirt road that led to the cabin, the trees around me getting denser as I went further into the woods. When I finally saw the cabin, nestled between towering pines, I felt a rush of excitement. It was a small, rustic cabin, nothing fancy, but that was part of the appeal. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted isolation, simplicity. A small porch with a rocking chair faced the woods, and behind the cabin, there was a small stream that gently gurgled. Perfect. I unloaded my car, bringing in just the essentials. A few books, a flashlight, a lighter, some snacks, and a sleeping bag. I wasn't planning on staying too long, just 2 nights, enough to disconnect and recharge. The inside of the cabin was as I expected. One room with a bed, a small kitchenette, a table, and a wood stove for heating. The floors creaked under my feet, but everything seemed solid enough. The windows were covered with old, slightly faded curtains, but the view from them was incredible. The trees stretched out endlessly, and the air smelled fresh, like pine and earth. I settled in quickly, lighting a fire in the stove. It crackled to life, filling the room with warmth. The night was coming, and the temperature was dropping quickly. I made myself some tea, then sat in the rocking chair outside on the porch. The sun set slowly, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves in the breeze and the occasional call of a distant bird. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. As darkness fell, I went inside, locking the door behind me. The night was quiet, and the forest was still. I kept the fire going, not wanting the cold to creep in. I sat in the chair by the fire, reading my book, but something felt off. The silence in the cabin seemed to be pressing in on me. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just me and the woods. There was no one else around for miles. As the night stretched on, I felt the unease grow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would hear a twig snap outside, or the sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. But when I would look out the window or step outside, nothing was there. The forest was as still as ever. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something wasn't quite right. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed. The fire was starting to die down, and the temperature in the cabin was dropping. I pulled the covers up, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. The wind outside began to pick up, howling through the trees. It sounded like it was getting closer, the wind rattling the cabin's walls and making the windows shake. Every gust of wind made the trees groan, like they were whispering secrets to each other. I tossed and turned, the unease refusing to leave. I kept imagining strange shapes moving outside, shadows in the corner of my eyes. I would sit up, heart pounding, but when I looked around, nothing was there. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up suddenly to the sound of something heavy moving outside. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The noise wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the creaking of branches. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Someone was outside. My mind raced, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a bear or a deer. But no, the steps were too loud, too human. I lay there in the dark, my body tense, listening intently. The noise continued, moving slowly along the side of the cabin. It was like whoever or whatever was out there was pacing, circling the cabin. I could hear the occasional scratch of nails against the wooden walls, like someone was dragging their hand along the cabin's sides. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was probably an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside the bed and slowly crept to the window, trying to peer through the curtains. My breath caught when I saw a dark figure standing just outside. It was tall, too tall to be a bear or a deer. It was human-shaped, but the way it stood was unnatural. It was motionless, staring into the cabin. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. I couldn't see its face clearly, but the figure didn't move. It was like it was waiting, watching. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The figure didn't move. I wanted to grab my things and run, but I knew the woods were dangerous at night. The best option was to stay inside, keep quiet, and hope whatever was lost interest. I sat in the corner of the cabin, flashlight in hand, and waited. The silence was deafening, and every time the wind blew or a branch cracked, I jumped. Around 2 a.m., the noises stopped. The figure outside disappeared. I was left in the quiet of the cabin, unsure if it had really been there or if I had imagined it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. By morning, the sun had risen, and the forest was once again peaceful. I stepped outside tentatively, my heart still racing from the events of the night before. There was no sign of anyone. The ground was still, undisturbed. I checked around the cabin, but nothing seemed out of place. The trees were just trees. The birds were chirping, and the only thing that seemed unusual was the lingering sense of dread I couldn't shake. I spent the rest of the day inside, only venturing out to gather firewood. I kept the doors locked and the windows closed, constantly feeling like someone was watching me from the trees. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind made me jump. I had never been more aware of the forest around me, the stillness that felt like it was closing in on me. That night, I made the decision to leave. The peace I had come to find in nature had turned into a suffocating, claustrophobic fear. I didn't know who or what had been outside my cabin the night before, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. Packing up my things quickly, I grabbed my car keys and headed out. The forest was dark and silent, the trees like black sentinels lining the road. I drove fast, my headlights cutting through the darkness, my heart still pounding in my chest. The road felt endless, the trees pressing in on either side, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the forest. I was shaken, but I was safe. I had no explanation for what had happened. There was no logical reason for a person to be out there in the woods at night, in the middle of nowhere, just standing outside my cabin. I never found out who or what it was, but I never went back to that cabin again. The woods had taken on a new meaning for me now. What I once thought was peaceful and serene was now a place of mystery and fear. I had gone looking for solitude, but I had found something else entirely. The forest had secrets, and I wasn't meant to know them. And sometimes, it's better to leave those secrets untouched. I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into when I decided to rent a small cabin for a weekend getaway. It wasn't far from civilization, but it felt like it was. The road that led to it was long and winding, cutting through dense woods that seemed like they had never been touched by human hands. The GPS told me I was close, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw when I pulled up to the cabin. It looked older than the pictures had suggested. The wood was worn, with the paint peeling off in patches, the roof slightly sagging in the middle as though time had been taking its toll. It was one of those old, rustic places that had character, but it also had a history that I wasn't yet sure I wanted to learn. I had hoped for a peaceful weekend to clear my head, to escape the noise of everyday life. But the moment I set foot on the porch, something didn't sit right. I opened the door and stepped inside. The smell of wood, dust, and something a bit mustier filled the air. The cabin was small but cozy. The furniture looked old but comfortable enough. A fireplace stood at one end of the room, and a window on the far wall let in soft, natural light. I set my bags down and walked around, taking in the details. The cabin had charm, sure, but it felt empty, in a way that made me uneasy, like it was waiting for something. I didn't let myself get too caught up in the odd feeling I was having. I had a book and a bottle of wine, and the weekend was all about unwinding. I went to the kitchen to grab a glass, and that's when I noticed it. The strange scratch marks on the floor. They weren't deep, but they were noticeable enough, like something or someone had dragged across the wood. I knelt down to get a better look. The marks led toward the back of the cabin, toward the bedroom, but stopped just before reaching it. I told myself it was nothing, just an old place with some wear and tear. I didn't want to dwell on it. The last thing I needed was to work myself up over nothing. So I made my wine, curled up on the couch and read for a few hours. But as the sun set and the shadows grew long, the uneasy feeling crept back in. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made every creak and groan of the old building seem 10 times louder. I could hear the wind rustling outside, but there was something else in the air, something off. I went to bed later that night trying to shake the feeling. The bed was uncomfortable, but I managed to fall asleep eventually. I awoke to a sound. It was soft at first, a faint scratching noise, like someone running their nails across the walls. My heart raced as I lay in the dark, listening. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the noise kept coming soft and steady. It felt like it was getting closer, but there was no logical reason for it. The walls of the cabin were thick, the windows tightly shut. Nothing could be making that noise. I wanted to get up and investigate, but the thought of getting out of bed, of facing whatever was causing the sound, made me freeze. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, the sun had risen, but it didn't feel any better. The silence was still too much. I got up, made some coffee, and went outside to clear my head. The air was cold, but refreshing, and for a moment, I felt like everything would be fine. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on the calm, the peace of being away from everything. That's when I noticed the marks again. They were outside this time, the same scratches I had seen inside, but now they were on the porch, leading down the steps and into the woods. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at them. The same pattern, the same randomness, but this time, the marks were fresher, as though someone or something had walked across the porch just that morning. I don't know why, but I decided to follow them. Something about the marks pulled me in like a puzzle I had to solve. I didn't think about the fact that it was stupid or dangerous. I just walked, letting the scratches guide me deeper into the woods. The trail was faint but clear enough to follow, cutting through the underbrush and winding around trees. I walked for what felt like an hour, my mind racing. What could have made these marks? Why were they leading me deeper into the forest? Every step I took, I felt more exposed, more vulnerable. But still, I pressed on. The further I went, the less I saw. The trees grew denser, blocking out the light, and the path became harder to follow. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every part of me told me to turn back, but something, maybe curiosity, maybe fear, kept me going. The scratches led to a clearing, and in the middle of it stood an old, decaying shed. It was almost completely hidden by overgrown vines and trees, but there it was. I stared at it for a long time, not sure what to do next. The shed looked abandoned, its wooden walls warped and sagging. The roof was caved in places, and the door was half hanging off its hinges. There was no reason for me to go inside, no reason to investigate further. But I had to know. I pushed the door open, the wood creaking loudly as it gave way. The inside of the shed was dark and musty. There was nothing of value inside, just old furniture, piles of rotting wood, and dust. But something about it felt wrong. The air felt thicker, as if something had been trapped inside for a long time. I walked in cautiously, my feet crunching on the debris beneath me. That's when I saw it. A small box, tucked away in the corner. It looked out of place, new and untouched, despite everything else in the shed being covered in decay. My hands shook as I reached for it. It wasn't locked, but it was heavier than I expected. I opened it slowly, the hinges squeaking as they gave way. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in old cloth. I unwrapped it carefully. Inside, there were old, faded photographs. Most of them were too blurry to make out, but one stood out. A picture of the cabin, taken from a distance. The photo was old, but the cabin looked almost the same as it did now. It was surrounded by the same trees, the same setting. But what caught my eye were the people standing in front of it. There were two men, both with dark expressions, standing just outside the door, looking directly at the camera. I didn't recognize them, but something about their gaze sent a chill down my spine. I set the photo down, my mind racing. Was this a coincidence? Why was it here? I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard it again. The scratching. It was coming from inside the shed this time. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There was no one else around, no animal that could have made that noise. My heart raced as I backed toward the door, but the scratching grew louder, more frantic. I didn't wait to see what was making the sound. I ran. I didn't look back until I was safely back inside the cabin. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I bolted it shut. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to distract myself, but the feeling of being watched never left. The evening came, and with it, more silence. But it was a different kind of silence. It felt heavier now, like something was lingering just beyond the edges of my vision. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, I packed up and left, my nerves on edge as I drove away from the cabin. I didn't care if I didn't finish my weekend getaway. I just needed to leave. As I drove away, I glanced at the cabin one last time in my rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window. I didn't stop to find out. When I got home, I looked up the history of the cabin. The place had been built in the early 1900s, and there had been reports of strange occurrences surrounding it. People who had stayed there over the years mentioned odd sounds, sightings, and unexplained events. I couldn't find any information about the two men in the photo, but I didn't need to. I never went back to that cabin. I was supposed to be there for just a weekend. Nothing too complicated, just a quick getaway. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest, and that was the whole point. A place to unplug and get some peace. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the narrow dirt road. The last stretch was bumpy, and the tires of my car kicked up little clouds of dust as I made my way toward the cabin. At first, I didn't notice anything odd. The place looked pretty much like you'd expect. A small wooden cabin with a wraparound porch, a stone chimney poking out of the roof, and a few trees around it, their branches heavy with leaves. It seemed like a peaceful retreat. The cabin was empty when I stepped inside, save for the dusty furniture and the musty smell of wood that had been sitting unused for too long. A single lamp on the far wall was the only thing lighting the place, casting a soft glow on the dark wood panels. There was no one else around. No neighbors, no sound of traffic, no hustle. Just quiet. I set my bag on the couch and walked over to the small kitchen. A pot sat on the stove, but the smell of old and used metal made my stomach churn a little. It didn't look like anyone had used the cabin recently, though everything seemed well kept. I decided I'd stay for the night. No need to get too worked up over a little dust and silence. The first night was uneventful. I made some food, ate, and settled in by the fireplace. It was cold out, and the warmth from the fire made the cabin feel like home. I couldn't have asked for a more relaxing evening. But as I settled into bed later that night, something felt off. The bed was comfortable enough, and I thought I'd sleep soundly. But around midnight, I woke up with a start. I couldn't explain why, but I had a sense that something wasn't right. The wind had picked up outside, and the branches of the trees scraped against the windows. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes again, but there was a feeling in the air. Something thick, almost suffocating. I thought about getting up, maybe checking out the windows, but I stayed put, trying to reassure myself that I was being paranoid. After all, it was just the wind, right? Still, I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that I was being watched. I eventually fell back into a restless sleep. The next morning, the sky was overcast, and the air felt colder than before. I made breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, feeling more on edge than I had the night before. The quiet of the cabin was starting to get to me, and it was almost unnerving how still the forest seemed. There was no birdsong, no rustling of leaves, just an unsettling calm. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, making my way toward the wooded area behind the cabin. The forest was thick, the trees towering over me, their trunks covered in moss. It felt like I was walking through a painting, the shadows from the clouds above stretching long across the ground. But after a while, I began to notice something strange. The path I was following seemed to curve unnaturally, like it was taking me deeper into the woods. At first, I figured it was just my mind playing tricks. The path twisted and turned, but that's how trails worked in forests, right? But the deeper I walked, the more isolated I felt. I had no idea how far I'd gone, but the cabin was no longer visible. And the trees, they felt different now. Their branches loomed over me like dark, watching hands. I couldn't help but glance back, half expecting someone or something to be following me. I tried to turn around, but the path I'd taken seemed to have changed. The trees blocked my way, and I could no longer see the familiar landmarks I had passed. Panic started to creep into my chest, tightening with every step I took. The silence was deafening. I felt lost, alone. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, and it was hard to tell how much time had passed. I stumbled, tripping over a root, and that's when I saw it. A small, weathered building, almost hidden by the overgrowth. It wasn't the cabin. This was different. A shack of some kind, barely standing. Its roof was sagging, and the wood was gray with age, cracked and splintered in places. I couldn't explain why, but it gave me a sick feeling in my stomach. Something about it didn't feel right. Against my better judgment, I approached it, my heart pounding. The door was slightly ajar, and as I peered inside, I saw nothing but darkness. The air around the shack was heavier, like the trees themselves were pressing in on me. A strange smell, like old earth and rotting wood, drifted out. I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, to leave this place behind. But then I noticed something else. In the dirt near the doorway, there were fresh tracks. Not animal tracks, human tracks. They were too recent to be from anyone else but the person who had been here, and the thought made my stomach lurch. I looked around, trying to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up my spine, but there was no one in sight. I turned quickly, my feet carrying me back toward the path, but I couldn't shake the image of the shack from my mind. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it lingered. I kept walking, but the further I went, the more I realized I wasn't sure where I was. I'd walked too far, lost my sense of direction, and now the woods were beginning to feel claustrophobic. The trees pressed in closer, and the air grew thick and heavy. By the time I found the trail back to the cabin, I was shaken. My heart was racing, and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. I half expected someone to be there, following me, but no one was. The cabin looked the same when I returned. Quiet, still, as if nothing had happened. I didn't stay outside much after that. The forest, once peaceful, now felt like a maze, and the air had changed somehow. The silence weighed down on me, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. I locked the door that night, something I hadn't done the night before, and pulled the curtains tight. The hours stretched on in the cabin, and the unsettling feeling from earlier never fully faded. I tried to get some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts kept returning to that shack in the woods, the way it felt wrong, like it was hiding something. What was it doing out here so far from the cabin? The next morning, the silence was even more oppressive. I woke early, packed up my things, and left before the sun had fully risen. I didn't want to stay another minute in that place. As I drove away, the trees loomed behind me, their branches casting long shadows across the road. But I didn't look back. Couldn't. I don't know what I saw out there, and I don't know what I disturbed, but I do know one thing. Some places are meant to stay forgotten. The shack in the woods. Whatever it was, I'm not sure I want to know, but I do know I won't be going back there again. The wind howled through the trees as I made my way up the narrow, winding dirt road, the headlights of my car casting long, eerie shadows along the edges of the forest. It was late, around midnight, and I had been driving for hours, far past the point where any signs of civilization had disappeared. The cabin I rented was supposed to be a secluded getaway, a peaceful retreat from the chaos of city life. I had no intention of staying in a crowded hotel, so when I found the listing for a small, isolated cabin in the woods, I thought it would be perfect. I wasn't scared. At least, I didn't think I would be. The idea of spending a weekend in a remote cabin, far from the noise and distractions of modern life, was exactly what I needed. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a place to relax and recharge. But as I drove deeper into the woods, the silence around me started to feel oppressive, almost suffocating. The trees were thick here, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers, blocking out most of the moonlight. I tried to shake off the unease that crept up on me, focusing on the road ahead. Eventually, I turned a sharp corner, and there it was, the cabin. The headlights of my car illuminated its weathered, wooden exterior, casting long shadows that made it seem almost ancient. The roof was sagging in places, and the porch had a noticeable dip in the middle. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but the listing had mentioned it was recently renovated. I pulled into the gravel driveway, parked my car, and stepped out into the cold night air. The scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs as I grabbed my bags from the trunk. The cabin was small, a one-story building with a stone chimney and a single front door. A set of worn wooden steps led up to the porch, and a single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a faint yellow glow over the front. It looked peaceful enough, though the sagging roof and peeling paint gave it a certain charm, if you could call it that. I pulled my bags inside, closing the door behind me. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly cozy. The main room had a stone fireplace at one end, with a few old chairs scattered around a rough-hewn wooden table. The floors creaked beneath my feet as I explored further, my boots echoing through the empty space. The small kitchen was to my right, with a narrow hallway leading to what I assumed were the bedroom and bathroom. I unpacked my things, setting my bag down on the bed in the back room and then starting a fire in the fireplace. The crackling sound of the wood burning was soothing, a stark contrast to the silence outside. I turned on the radio for some background noise, but it was static-laden, nothing but a faint buzz that did little to fill the space. I flicked it off, deciding to embrace the quiet. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept fitfully, but that was to be expected. It wasn't uncommon for me to have trouble adjusting to new places. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of birds calling out in the trees. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the forest. I made coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the woods around me. The cabin was even more isolated than I had expected. There was no sign of anyone else for miles in any direction. It felt peaceful, almost serene, despite the lingering unease I couldn't quite shake. I decided to go for a hike that morning, to explore the area and get some fresh air. I grabbed my jacket, laced up my boots, and headed out the door. The woods were dense, with thick underbrush and towering trees that blocked out most of the light. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles on the ground. It was quiet here, too quiet. No animals, no rustling in the trees, just the occasional creak of the branches swaying in the wind. As I walked further, the trail started to narrow. I glanced back occasionally, but the cabin was already hidden from view behind the thick trees. I wasn't concerned, just a little unsettled. There was something about this place, something about the stillness of the forest, that made me uneasy. I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself it was just the isolation. After a few hours of walking, I turned around and headed back to the cabin. The sunlight was starting to fade, and the woods seemed even quieter than before. When I reached the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door, which I had left shut tight when I left, was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat as I approached cautiously. The door wasn't wide open, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. I didn't remember leaving it that way, but I chalked it up to me being distracted or forgetful. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way when I left. I stepped inside, and everything seemed normal at first. My bags were still in the same spot, and the fire had burned down to embers. But there was a strange, musty smell in the air, like something had been left out too long. I walked through the cabin, checking each room, but there was nothing obviously out of place. Still, the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. That night, the wind picked up. The trees outside creaked and groaned in the breeze, and the occasional thud echoed through the cabin, like something was hitting the side of the building. It was probably just a branch or a loose shutter, but the sound was unsettling in the dead of night. I stayed by the fire, my eyes flicking to the windows every so often, expecting to see something or someone standing outside. But there was nothing, just darkness. As the night wore on, I started to hear footsteps. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just the house settling. But then the footsteps grew louder, as though someone was walking around the cabin. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and moved toward the door. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to see, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood by the door for what felt like hours, my hand resting on the knob, ready to throw it open if necessary. But the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started, and the night was once again still. I waited, listening intently, but nothing happened. Eventually, I closed the door and locked it, then slid a heavy chair in front of it, just in case. I was being paranoid, I told myself, just tired from the isolation. The next morning, I was determined to push past whatever it was that was bothering me. I went outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. There were no signs of anyone being around, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing that indicated someone had been there. I even checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. But despite all of this, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That evening, as the sun set and the forest grew darker, I heard the footsteps again. They were faint at first, just like before, but this time they seemed to be coming from inside the cabin. I froze, my heart racing. I knew I was alone. I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day. I stood up, gripping the arm of the chair as I listened, straining to hear any sound that might explain what was happening. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was just a shadow at first, darting across the room like a quick, fleeting thought. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly turned to face it, but the room was empty. I ran to the door and yanked it open. The cold night air hit me hard, but I didn't care. I bolted out of the cabin, moving quickly into the woods. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get away, to escape the oppressive silence that had been suffocating me. I stumbled through the trees, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I must have run for miles, but eventually, I stopped, unable to go any further. My legs were shaking, and my mind was spinning. I turned back, realizing how far I had gotten from the cabin. It felt like a lifetime since I had left. I started walking back, trying to calm myself down. When I returned, the cabin was just as I had left it, empty and still. There was no sign of anyone, no evidence that anything had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. Maybe I had just been imagining things. Maybe it had all been a product of my own fear. That night, I slept soundly for the first time since I arrived. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I couldn't shake the feeling of relief as I drove away from the cabin, the dense forest slowly fading into the distance behind me. I never went back, and as the years passed, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. Maybe I had just let the isolation get to me, but deep down, I knew that something had been wrong with that place, something I couldn't explain. I didn't want to know what it was, and I was just glad I never had to find out. The night was settling in as I drove deeper into the woods. I had been planning this trip for a while, a weekend away from the hustle of city life. The cabin I had rented was secluded, a tiny, weather-beaten structure tucked far from any signs of civilization. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just me and the woods. I had always liked the idea of being alone in nature. I had read up on the area, made sure it was safe. The cabin was a small, old building made of timber, with a porch and a fireplace. The owner had warned me that the place was a little out of the way, but I didn't mind. In fact, that was the appeal. No one would be around for miles, just the silence and the forest. The road leading to the cabin was narrow and winding. As I drove, the trees seemed to grow closer together, blocking out the fading light from the sky. The last rays of the sun barely pierced through the thick canopy above. By the time I reached the cabin, it was almost completely dark. I pulled up to the small clearing, parked the car, and grabbed my bags. The air felt cool, even for late summer, and there was an odd stillness in the woods. No crickets, no wind, just quiet. I walked up to the front door and unlocked it. The key was a rusty thing, like it hadn't been used in years. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and pine. The furniture was basic but functional. An old couch, a small table, and a few mismatched chairs. There was a fireplace against one wall, and a large window that overlooked the forest. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the hearth. The crackling sound of the flames was oddly soothing. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, ate a simple dinner, and spent a few hours reading. The wind picked up outside, but it wasn't anything alarming. I didn't mind the sounds of the trees shifting in the breeze, or the occasional creak of the cabin. I slept soundly, wrapped up in blankets, with the fire still flickering softly in the fireplace. The next morning, I woke early, the sunlight filtering through the windows in pale shafts of gold. I stepped outside onto the porch and inhaled deeply. The air was fresh, crisp with the smell of pine and earth. There was something oddly peaceful about it, but also unsettling in a way I couldn't quite place. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, no signs of other human life for miles. I decided to go for a walk, just to explore the area a bit. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional bird call. The trees were massive here, their trunks thick and gnarled with age. As I walked further, the ground beneath my boots turned soft and spongy, as if the forest floor had absorbed years of rain. The path wound through dense undergrowth, and I had to duck under low-hanging branches a few times. I wasn't sure how far I had gone, but it didn't matter. There was no hurry. I walked for hours until the sun was high in the sky. I had strayed far enough from the cabin that I began to feel a twinge of unease. It wasn't anything specific, just an instinct. The woods were too still, too quiet. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, just silence. I turned around and began the walk back, but the path I had taken didn't look the same. It was as if the trees had shifted, or the path had been swallowed by the forest. I stopped and looked around, but everything looked the same. Dense trees, thick underbrush, and the occasional boulder scattered across the ground. I wasn't lost, but the disorienting feeling lingered. I kept walking, pushing through the brush, trying to find a familiar landmark. Eventually, I spotted the clearing where the cabin should be, just up ahead. The sense of unease didn't fade, but I kept moving forward. I stepped back onto the porch, relieved to be home, if only for the moment. The evening was calm, but the strange feeling didn't leave. I tried to push it away, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I started another fire in the fireplace and settled in for a quiet night. The wind outside had died down completely, and for the first time since arriving, the woods felt unnaturally still. That night, I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black, and the air in the room felt heavy. At first, I couldn't figure out why I had woken up, but then I heard it. A faint sound, like something tapping against the window. It was soft, almost imperceptible. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind or some animal outside. But it continued, the tapping growing more insistent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and padded across the room to the window. I peered outside, but there was nothing. The porch was empty, and the trees were motionless. My heart was racing, but I tried to calm myself down. Maybe a branch had shifted in the wind and tapped against the glass. I returned to bed, pulling the covers tight around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tapping didn't come again that night, but I couldn't fall back asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows moving outside the window, just beyond the trees. The next morning, I decided I needed to get out. The unease I had been feeling for days was building up, and I needed to clear my head. I packed up some supplies, grabbed a knife, and set off into the woods again. The sunlight was stronger today, but the air still had that strange heaviness to it. I walked further this time, pushing myself to go beyond the point where I had wandered yesterday. After a few hours, I stopped by a creek to drink some water. The sound of the rushing water was soothing, and I found myself relaxing for the first time since arriving. I sat on a rock and closed my eyes, just letting the quiet of the forest wash over me. But the feeling of being watched returned, creeping up my spine like an invisible presence. I stood quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I noticed it. There, just past the trees, was something moving. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but it was too fast, too erratic. The movement was unnatural, jerky, as if whatever it was wasn't used to being in the woods. I grabbed my knife and moved toward the edge of the forest, keeping my eyes trained on the movement. It was getting closer, but I couldn't make out any details. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I had to know what it was. As I reached the edge of the woods, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was nothing there. The forest was completely still, the air thick with silence. I looked around, confused and shaken, but all I saw were the same towering trees, their leaves rustling faintly in the breeze. I stood there for a long moment, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I turned and walked back to the cabin, faster now, as if something was following me. When I returned, I locked the door behind me. The silence outside was suffocating. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the fire, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would clear my mind. But as I lay in bed, listening to the crackling of the fire, I heard it again, the faint tapping at the window. This time, I didn't get up. I didn't want to know what was out there. Instead, I pulled the blankets tighter around me and forced my eyes shut. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, just the woods. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. The tapping stopped, but I still didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't even bother to check the cabin before I left. The unease, the feeling of being watched, was too much. The woods had gotten inside my head, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what else it had in store. As I drove away, the road seemed to stretch on forever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that the woods were watching me leave. The day I arrived at the cabin, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with anxiety. It was my first time staying in a secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere. My friends had always talked about it, the idea of getting away from the noise of the city, disconnecting from everything, and just being alone with nature. No phones, no distractions, just the wilderness and the small cabin that was meant to be our home for the next few days. The drive up had been long. The winding roads through thick forest felt like they would never end. But finally, I saw it. The little wooden cabin nestled among the trees, looking like it had been there for decades. The place wasn't exactly what I expected, though. I thought it would be cozy, rustic, the perfect hideaway. But instead, it looked old, worn, and a little bit run down. The wood was chipped and gray, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. The cabin sat alone, with no other buildings around, just a few overgrown trails leading into the thick forest. It didn't feel as welcoming as I had imagined, but I shrugged it off. I was here to get away from everything, to escape the world for a few days. I could deal with the cabin's quirks. I grabbed my duffel bag from the car and made my way up the creaky wooden steps to the front door. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. It felt cooler here, the temperature dropping as the sun began to set behind the mountains. I pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the place was dim, lit only by the weak light that seeped in through the grimy windows. A small living area greeted me, with a worn-out couch, a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and a coffee table cluttered with old magazines. The kitchen was tucked off to the side, small but functional, with a wood-burning stove and a fridge that hummed faintly. The bathroom was just down the hall, and the bedroom was upstairs, small but with a large window that overlooked the forest. I didn't have high expectations for comfort, but I was okay with that. The silence was what I craved, the peace that came with being so far removed from civilization. I spent the first few hours exploring the cabin, unpacking my things, and then just sitting by the window, watching the fading sunlight filter through the trees. The wind rustled the leaves, and the occasional bird call broke the silence, but otherwise, it was quiet, eerily quiet. As the darkness started to settle in, I lit a candle in the living room, not wanting to deal with the overhead lights. The flickering flame gave the room a soft, warm glow, and I sat there for a while, just listening to the sounds of the night. It was peaceful, but there was something about the silence that felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped further, and I decided it was time to get some sleep. I grabbed a blanket from the couch and made my way upstairs to the bedroom. The bed was simple, with an old quilt thrown over the top, but it looked comfortable enough. I pulled the quilt over myself and turned off the light, the room plunging into darkness. The wind outside was louder now, howling through the trees, and the occasional creak of the cabin settling made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was just the wind, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. The next day would be better, I thought. I would explore the trails, maybe do some fishing in the nearby stream. Everything would be fine, but sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned, the creaking of the cabin and the wind outside making it impossible to relax. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched, like there was something just outside the window, waiting for me to fall asleep. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of a door creaking open. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to the bedroom was ajar, just slightly, but it wasn't open when I had gone to bed. I sat up quickly, listening intently. The only sound was the wind outside, but I could swear I heard something else. A faint rustling, like someone was moving around downstairs. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe I had left a window open and the wind was causing something to move around. Maybe it was an animal, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my stomach. I slowly got out of bed, my feet cold on the wooden floor. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and quietly made my way downstairs, trying not to make any noise. The living room was empty, but the door to the kitchen was open, and I could see a faint light coming from the crack. My heart raced as I moved toward it, my breath shallow. I was sure I had closed that door when I went to bed. The kitchen was dark, but there was something strange about the air, damp, musty, like something had been disturbed. I pushed open the door, and the beam of my flashlight swept across the room. Nothing. No one was there. I let out a sigh of relief, but something still didn't sit right. I scanned the room again, looking for anything out of place. That's when I saw it. On the counter, there was a knife. It wasn't there before. I knew for a fact that I hadn't left it there, and there was no reason for it to be out in the open. I grabbed the knife quickly, my fingers tightening around the handle, and stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, my mind racing. Had someone been in here? I couldn't think of any logical explanation. There were no other cabins nearby, and the road was too far away for anyone to have snuck up without being seen. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt the need to leave, to get out of the cabin and back to the safety of the car. But I couldn't just leave, not like this. I spent the next few hours pacing, trying to make sense of what had happened. The knife stayed on the counter, a reminder of whatever had been here. Eventually, the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the cabin. The sounds of the night had faded, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. I sat down by the window again, trying to calm my nerves. I told myself it was just a mistake, that I had left the knife out the night before and forgotten. But something in the pit of my stomach told me I was lying to myself. I didn't sleep that night, nor the next. Each creak, each rustle, each flicker of the candlelight made me jump, my mind unable to settle. But as the days passed, I started to find a rhythm. I explored the surrounding woods, walked the trails, and did my best to ignore the unease that lingered in the back of my mind. The cabin felt a little less eerie during the day, but when the sun set, the feeling would return, and I would be left alone with the silence, the shadows, and the cold. On the final day of my stay, I woke up to an odd sight. There was something outside the window, something I hadn't noticed before. At first, I thought it was just the shadows of the trees, but as I focused, I could see it. A figure, standing still at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the growing light. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling, and rushed outside. The figure was gone. There was nothing in the clearing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I spent the rest of the morning packing my things, eager to leave. I didn't want to be here a minute longer. As I drove down the winding road, leaving the cabin behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every glance in the rearview mirror seemed to show something moving in the trees, something just out of sight. But when I stopped and looked, there was nothing. I drove faster, my pulse racing, until the road began to clear, and I could see the highway in the distance. Finally, I pulled over and took a deep breath, feeling the tension leave my body. The cabin was behind me now, and I had survived it. As I drove back into civilization, I couldn't help but feel like something in the forest had been watching me. But at least I was safe. At least I was leaving it all behind. I woke up to the sound of rain tapping lightly against the windows, a soft, rhythmic patter that seemed almost soothing in the middle of the night. I didn't have to look at the clock to know it was late. Everything felt heavy and still. It was one of those kinds of nights when the air outside feels like it's been soaked in moisture, and every breath you take carries the weight of the weather. I could hear the wind picking up too, rustling the trees outside in a way that sounded both natural and unnerving. I lay there for a while, trying to push the sleepiness back and force myself to be awake. There were so many things I should have done earlier in the day. The cabin was small, just one main room with a loft where the bed was, a kitchen nook below, and a tiny bathroom tucked off to the side. I had rented this place for the weekend, hoping to escape the noise of the city, to get away from the constant buzzing of phones, emails, and people. But now, here I was, alone in the dark, rain soaking into the ground, the only light coming from the thin sliver of moon peeking out from behind the clouds. I hadn't expected the isolation to hit so hard. The woods surrounding the cabin were dense, and the nearest neighbor was a good mile down the road. This place was remote, too remote maybe. I could feel it now, this crawling unease in my chest that hadn't been there before. I decided to get up. Maybe moving around would clear my head. As I swung my legs out of bed, the cold wood of the floor beneath my feet made me shiver. I grabbed a hoodie from the chair and pulled it on, the soft fabric doing little to fend off the chill that seemed to seep in from the walls themselves. I walked over to the small kitchen, the air in the room heavy with the smell of damp wood and earth. The rain had intensified, hammering the roof with a fury that made it feel as though the cabin was trapped in the center of a storm. I thought about making some coffee, but the thought of standing there waiting for the kettle to boil felt too much like a waste of time. Instead, I walked over to the window and looked outside. The rain blurred the glass, but I could make out the shapes of the trees swaying violently in the wind. The road that led up to the cabin was barely visible, swallowed by the thick undergrowth and the dark blur of rain. I shivered, pulling the curtains closed again. The weather was unsettling, but it was more than just that. I hadn't been able to shake the feeling since I first arrived here. This constant sense that something wasn't quite right. It was too quiet, too still. I shook my head and tried to push the thought away. Maybe I was just tired. I glanced at the fireplace, the small wood-burning stove sitting there like an old friend. It was cold, and I hadn't bothered to light it earlier, figuring the heat from the space heater would be enough. I thought about making a fire, but then I heard it. A faint noise, something scraping against the wall. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. I couldn't say what it was at first. It wasn't a sound you could easily place. It wasn't the wind or the rain or anything natural. It was too deliberate, too precise, like someone or something was pushing against the side of the cabin. My heart started to pound in my chest, and for a moment, I stood frozen, just listening. The sound stopped, then started again. Faint, but distinct. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't just stand there. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer by the kitchen, my hands shaking slightly as I turned it on. I moved cautiously toward the front door. The noise stopped, and for a brief second, I thought maybe I was overreacting. It had to be the wind or an animal. It wasn't possible that someone would be out here. No one could get to the cabin without a long walk or a very bumpy ride. I opened the door just a crack, peering out into the storm. The wind was so strong it nearly yanked the door out of my hands. The porch was empty, nothing but the dark blur of trees and rain. But there was something off about the silence. The rain, the wind, the trees all seemed to pause for just a second. It was as if they were holding their breath. I stepped outside, my boots slipping slightly on the wet wood of the porch. I shone the flashlight out toward the edge of the woods, but the beam only cut through a few feet of the night before disappearing into the shadows. There was no sign of anything or anyone. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably just a branch rubbing against the cabin in the wind. It had to be. I stepped back inside and closed the door with a thud, feeling the weight of the air settle back into place. My pulse was still racing, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to lie back down or if I needed to investigate further. I debated going out to check the perimeter of the cabin, but it was cold, and the storm was relentless. The wind howled outside, as though mocking my decision to step out there at all. I walked back into the kitchen and turned on the kettle. The noise of the water filling the pot was oddly comforting in the otherwise tense silence. The storm, however, seemed to be getting worse. I could feel the tension in the air, the kind that presses against your skin, like it's about to crack open and change everything. The storm wasn't just rain anymore. It was the force of something much bigger, something primal. Then there was the noise again, a louder scrape, this time more forceful, more insistent. It sounded like it was coming from the back of the cabin. I couldn't ignore it this time. My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt the blood rush to my ears. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hand trembling as I clicked it on, and rushed toward the back door. I flung it open without thinking, the wind almost knocking it back in my face. There was nothing there, nothing but the thick, dark wall of trees, the wild motion of the storm. The rain beat against the ground, the wind howled, and the trees swayed violently. But then I saw it. figure. It was standing just beyond the tree line, still as a statue. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to breathe, didn't even react to the storm around it. It was only the shape of a person standing still, watching. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, or even if it was human. The figure was too far away, obscured by the darkness of the woods and the whipping rain. But the unmistakable feeling of being watched washed over me in waves. A shiver ran through me. I knew I had to go inside. The moment I stepped back into the cabin, I bolted the door shut. I checked the windows, all the locks. I moved quickly through the house, checking every corner, every door, every window. Nothing, no sign of anyone. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I spent the rest of the night by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to keep my mind from wandering. Every crackle from the wood seemed like a knock at the door. Every gust of wind seemed like someone trying to break in. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there, wide-eyed, waiting for something I couldn't explain. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was still quiet. The wind had died down, and the rain had turned into a gentle mist that hung in the air. The cabin, for all its eeriness the night before, now looked peaceful, like it had always been that way. I decided to leave. There was something in the woods that didn't sit right, something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't stay there another night. As I loaded up my car, ready to head back home, I saw something in the dirt near the edge of the cabin. A footprint. It was fresh. I got in my car, slammed the door shut, and drove off without looking back. The cabin stood at the edge of the woods, nestled between towering pines that whispered in the wind. It was a small, weather-beaten place, looking as though it had been forgotten by time. The wood was gray from years of exposure to the elements, the roof slightly slanted, covered with a layer of moss that had grown thick over the years. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what I was looking for. I needed a break from everything, the noise, the constant rush, the endless distractions. A weekend to disconnect, to be alone, to think. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sky tinged with orange and purple as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, the kind of coolness that felt sharp against your skin but wasn't unbearable. The ground was soft underfoot, with fallen needles and leaves making a thick carpet. The cabin was remote, far from the nearest town. Perfect spot to escape to. There was no one around, no neighbors, no cabins nearby, just the stillness of the woods and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird overhead. I unloaded my car and grabbed my bag, heading toward the cabin. It creaked as I opened the door, the hinges groaning as though protesting the disturbance after years of silence. The smell of old wood and dust hit me. Inside, the air was musty, but not unpleasant. The space was small, with a single room, a fireplace on one side, and a few pieces of old furniture that looked like they hadn't been touched in ages. I could already tell that the place hadn't seen much use. The floorboards were uneven, and there was a noticeable draft. But I didn't mind. It added to the charm. I set my things down on the couch, which had seen better days but still seemed serviceable enough. There was a small kitchen area off to one side with an old stove and a sink that had likely never been updated. It was perfect. I had everything I needed. I threw my coat over the back of the chair, lit a fire in the fireplace, and unpacked my bag. The night fell quickly, the temperature dropping as the darkness enveloped the cabin. I could hear the wind picking up outside, shaking the branches of the trees, and the occasional thud of something heavy dropping to the ground. I spent the evening reading, a book I had meant to finish for months but never found the time to. It felt good to just be alone, to be in a place where the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. It was peaceful, too peaceful. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The fire was burning low, so I banked it with some more wood before heading to bed. The bed wasn't much, just a mattress on a frame, but it was comfortable enough. The blankets were warm, and I soon found myself drifting off to sleep. But then I woke up. It was the sound that got to me first. It was faint, at first, almost like a scratching. It was coming from the far corner of the cabin, near the window. My eyes snapped open and I lay still, listening. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get in. My breath hitched in my throat. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel that had gotten into the cabin. But as I lay there, listening to the sound, I started to feel a creeping unease. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded too purposeful. I quietly got out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The scratching continued, and I could now hear a low thudding noise, as if something was pushing against the walls. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly approached the window. The scratching stopped for a moment, and I held my breath. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the wind or an animal outside or the house settling. I reached the window and pulled back the curtain, shining the flashlight outside. There was nothing. The night was still, the trees swaying gently in the wind, but nothing that could explain the noise. I exhaled in relief and took a step back, feeling foolish for getting so worked up over nothing. But just as I was about to turn back to the bed, I heard it again. A sharp, desperate scratching, this time louder, more frantic. It came from the corner of the cabin, near the door. My blood ran cold. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I slowly turned to face the door. The wind outside howled louder, but this time, there was something else. The scratching was accompanied by a soft thudding, as if something was trying to get inside. I was certain now that it wasn't just an animal. It felt wrong. The sound was too human, too intentional. I didn't want to check, but I knew I had to. I moved to the door, my pulse racing, and slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open, and I stepped out onto the small porch. The air was colder than before, the wind biting at my skin. I scanned the area around the cabin, my eyes searching the darkness, but there was nothing there. The woods were silent, still, too still. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me. But there was nothing, just the trees, the wind, the quiet. I felt foolish, standing there in the cold night air, half expecting to see something out of the corner of my eye. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, feeling a little ridiculous for getting so worked up. The rest of the night passed without incident. I didn't hear the scratching again, and the wind died down. By morning, the fear that had settled in my chest had faded somewhat. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Just the wind, maybe some animals. The cabin was old, and it made strange noises. I wasn't used to the isolation. That was all. I spent the next day cleaning up around the cabin, chopping some firewood, and taking a walk in the woods. The sun was out, and it was a perfect fall day. The kind of day where everything feels peaceful and quiet. I had almost forgotten about the strange sounds from the night before. That night, though, as I settled back into bed, I heard it again. This time, the scratching was louder, closer, like it was right outside the cabin. My heart skipped a beat, and I lay still, listening. There was something different this time, something more urgent. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breathing shallow. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. I got up, my hands trembling as I grabbed the flashlight. I shone it through the cabin, scanning the room. The scratching stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe it was my imagination. But then I heard it again, even closer this time. I jumped at the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. It was coming from the door again. My mind raced. Was someone outside? Someone trying to break in? No, that didn't make sense. I was miles from the nearest road. Who would be out here? I crept to the door, heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned the knob and opened it just a crack. The cold night air rushed in, and I peered into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the trees, the night, the silence. I quickly shut the door again, but the feeling of unease only grew. I couldn't stay here another night. I had to leave. The next morning, I packed my things, double-checked that I hadn't left anything behind, and made sure the cabin was locked up. As I pulled away from the cabin, heading back down the narrow dirt road, I glanced back over my shoulder. The cabin stood there, silent, empty. I wasn't sure what I had experienced those 2 nights. Maybe it was just my imagination, the isolation, the weird noises of an old cabin. Maybe it was all in my head. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Something had been trying to get in. And no matter how much I told myself it was nothing, I knew I would never go back to that cabin again. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Something was off, and I had no intention of finding out what it was. The wind howled through the trees as I walked down the narrow, dirt path. The dark sky overhead hinted at a storm, but I wasn't concerned. I had walked this path countless times before, though tonight felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the task ahead, getting to the cabin before nightfall. I had rented the cabin for the weekend, hoping for some peace and quiet to clear my head. The city was suffocating, and I needed to disconnect from everything. No phone, no internet, just the quiet of the woods. The perfect escape. At least that's what I thought. The cabin was located a few miles off the main road, deep in the forest. I had been here once before, a year ago, and it had been a great getaway. The owner, a quiet man who didn't speak much, had made it clear that the place was old but well maintained. The cabin was simple. A small one-room building with a stone fireplace, a few windows, and basic furniture. No luxuries, but that was fine with me. I didn't need much. As I got closer, I noticed the trees seemed denser than I remembered. They were thicker, darker, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally in the dimming light. A chill crept up my spine, but I told myself it was just the wind picking up, causing the branches to sway in strange patterns. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. When I finally reached the cabin, I saw that the door was slightly ajar. I stopped in my tracks. I was sure I had locked it before leaving last time. I was always careful about things like that. I approached slowly, hesitant, but there didn't seem to be anyone around. Maybe I had just imagined it. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The familiar smell of pine and wood hit me immediately, but something else lingered in the air. Something faint, almost metallic, like rust. I frowned and glanced around. The cabin was just as I remembered it, but there was something off. The furniture was a little more worn. The floorboards creaked in places they didn't before. The fire pit had not been used in some time. I shrugged it off. Old cabins like these naturally showed signs of wear and tear. I locked the door behind me and set down my bag. My phone had no service, but that was to be expected out here. I took a deep breath and tried to relax. The sun was starting to set, so I made a fire in the hearth, using the dry wood stacked neatly in the corner. The flames crackled to life, casting flickering shadows across the room. I unpacked a few things, settled into the small wooden chair by the fire, and just let the heat wash over me. The storm was getting closer, the wind picking up outside. It was quiet in here, the kind of quiet that felt thick, almost oppressive. I shifted in my chair, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to stretch further than they should. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. The storm outside was likely making everything feel more intense. As the evening wore on, the storm grew louder, and the wind howled through the trees. The rain came down in sheets, beating against the roof and windows. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, staring into the fire. I tried to read, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the strange feeling I couldn't shake. It was as if I was being watched, though I was alone in the cabin. I kept hearing the sound of footsteps outside, faint but unmistakable. They weren't regular. They were uneven, like someone was stumbling through the woods. I stood up, heart racing, and went to the window. I peered out into the darkness, but I saw nothing. Just the rain, the trees swaying in the wind. I shook my head, telling myself it was the storm messing with my senses. But the feeling of unease grew. I checked the door again, ensuring it was locked. I didn't know why, but I felt safer knowing it was. The hours passed slowly, and eventually I gave up on reading. I lay down on the small cot, the covers pulled up to my chin. The fire had long since died down, and the only sound now was the relentless rain and the wind battering the cabin. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, kept me on edge. I must have dozed off eventually, but the strange noise outside woke me up a few hours later. It was subtle at first, just a soft scraping sound, like something was being dragged along the ground. I lay still, my heart pounding. The sound stopped. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but it didn't feel like that. The wind had a rhythm to it, a pattern, but this was different. It was deliberate. I listened closely, straining to hear. The scraping sound resumed, this time louder, closer. My mind raced. Was someone out there? Was there another cabin nearby? I knew the area was remote, but I had heard rumors of people living further down the trail, though I had never seen anyone. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and cautiously made my way to the door. The scraping continued, growing louder, but still no voices, no sign of life. I unlocked the door quietly, making sure it didn't creak. I stepped outside, holding the flashlight in front of me. The storm had intensified, the rain falling harder now, but the darkness outside was thick. I couldn't see far beyond the small patch of light from my flashlight. I strained my ears, trying to locate the source of the noise. It was coming from the far side of the cabin, beyond the tree line. The sound of something dragging, like it was being pulled slowly through the mud. I stood there, frozen, the beam of light shaking in my hands. The noise stopped abruptly, and an eerie silence filled the air. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. After a few moments, I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. My breath was shallow, my mind racing. I couldn't explain it. It was just too strange. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably some animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer, but something told me it wasn't. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. In fact, it had grown stronger, more pressing. I couldn't shake the thought that there was someone else out here with me. The storm raged on, and I finally decided to try and sleep. I didn't know how long I stayed awake, but the hours passed slowly, each minute dragging on like an eternity. The rain continued to pour down, the wind howling like it was trying to tear the cabin apart. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my body tense, my mind racing. Suddenly, there was a loud bang against the side of the cabin. My heart leapt into my throat, and I bolted upright. The noise was followed by another, then another, like something heavy was being thrown against the wall. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hands shaking, and slowly got to my feet. The banging continued, steady and rhythmic, like someone was trying to break through. Panic surged through me. What was happening? Who was out there? I moved to the window, my heart pounding. I didn't dare open the door again. Through the rain and the darkness, I saw nothing. No figures, no movement, just the trees swaying violently in the storm. But the banging was still there, echoing through the cabin, coming from the far side again. I backed away from the window, my mind spinning. The room was too quiet now, too still. The storm outside wasn't just loud, it was isolating. It felt like the world had closed in around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. I waited, tense, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The silence was deafening. I didn't know how much time passed, but eventually, I heard a sound again, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, uneven steps like someone dragging their feet through the mud. But they weren't outside this time. They were coming from inside the cabin. I froze, my blood running cold. The footsteps came closer, each one a slow, deliberate step. I could feel my heart thundering in my chest. I turned toward the door, knowing there was no way out. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, and then, just as quickly as they had started, they began again, this time moving away from me, toward the other side of the room. I stood there, paralyzed. For what felt like hours, my mind racing. My eyes never left the door, my body tense, waiting for the next move. The footsteps finally stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. It wasn't until the next morning that I dared leave the cabin. The storm had passed, the sun shining weakly through the clouds. The woods were quiet, peaceful even. I checked the outside of the cabin carefully, but there was no sign of any disturbance. Nothing had changed. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there. As I packed my things and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I wasn't sure what had happened during the night, but I knew one thing for certain. Something or someone had been watching me. I didn't stay another night. The drive back to the city felt too long, the road stretching endlessly before. It was one of those last-minute trips, the kind where you don't really have everything planned out and you're just throwing stuff in a bag, hoping you don't forget anything important. I'd been itching to get away for a few days, and a cabin I found online seemed perfect. Isolated, cheap, and exactly the kind of place I needed to escape to. The description on the website made it sound like a charming little cabin, tucked away in the woods. It wasn't too far from the nearest town, but it was far enough to make me feel like I was in the middle of nowhere. I packed my car with camping gear, a few snacks, and some warm clothes. The weather had been a bit unpredictable lately, and I didn't want to risk being caught out in the cold. The drive to the cabin was longer than I had expected, but that wasn't a problem. It gave me time to listen to the quiet hum of the road beneath me and think about nothing in particular. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set, and the sky was a mix of deep oranges and pinks. The cabin itself was small, like the kind you'd expect to see in a postcard. It was made of dark wood with a small porch and a large window that overlooked a small clearing surrounded by tall, dense trees. The cabin was exactly what I needed. Simple. No frills, just a place to rest and be alone. I pulled up to the front of the cabin and unpacked my things. The key was under the mat, just like the instructions had said. Inside, it was cozy, but sparse. There was a fireplace, a few old chairs, a table, and a small kitchen area with basic supplies. The bathroom was just off the kitchen, and there was a small loft upstairs that held a bed. It looked like it hadn't been used much, but it smelled faintly of wood and dust. It wasn't a bad smell, though kind of comforting in a way. I started a fire in the fireplace to warm the place up a little, unpacked some of my food, and settled in for the evening. The quietness of the place was almost overwhelming. There was no sound except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind outside. I spent the night in front of the fire, reading and listening to the sounds of nature creeping in from the woods around me. The isolation wasn't uncomfortable at first, but as the night deepened, I started to feel a little uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was just a strange feeling, like something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to sway in the wind, or how the cabin creaked every time the temperature dropped a little more. Whatever it was, I tried to ignore it. The fire kept me warm, and soon enough, I was drifting off to sleep in the loft. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. It wasn't loud, more of a soft tapping sound, almost like someone was gently knocking on the door. I stayed still, listening for a moment, trying to figure out if I had just imagined it. The wind had picked up, and it was possible that it was just a branch hitting the cabin. But something about it didn't sit right with me. The tapping came again, softer this time, like it was coming from the window. I was sure now that something was out there. The logical part of my brain told me it was probably an animal, maybe a squirrel or something, trying to get inside. But the rest of me felt uneasy, like I shouldn't go anywhere near the window. I got out of bed and slowly made my way down the stairs, my bare feet brushing against the cold floorboards. The tapping stopped as I reached the bottom of the stairs, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But when I turned the corner to the window, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, in the moonlight, standing just beyond the window, was a figure. It was hard to make out any details at first because of the darkness outside, but I could tell that it was tall and thin, and its head seemed to be tilted unnaturally to the side. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It was like it was waiting for me to do something. Couldn't help it. My hand reached for the handle of the door, and before I knew what I was doing, I was outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I had to see what was out there. The figure hadn't moved, and as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a tree, or at least it looked like a tree at first. The thing in front of me was tall and thin, but it had long, spindly branches that were moving in the wind. The more I looked at it, the more I realized how strange it was. It wasn't a normal tree, but something about it felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the branches twisted in unnatural ways, almost like they were reaching for me. I turned and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. I felt a knot of panic rising in my chest. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window again. The figure was gone. I told myself it had just been my imagination playing tricks on me. The wind had been strong, and I had probably misinterpreted the movement of the branches. But the unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, not even bothering to make coffee. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin was still there, standing alone in the clearing. It looked peaceful in the early morning light, but I knew better now. The woods had a way of hiding things, of making you feel like you were alone when you weren't. It was a long drive back, and the further I got from that place, the more I started to feel like I could breathe again. The strange, unsettling feeling began to fade, but I couldn't stop thinking about the figure, about what it really was, and about how, even though I had left, it felt like the woods were still watching me. By the time I made it back home, I felt safe, but I couldn't shake the image of that twisted figure out of my mind. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I'd never be going back to that cabin. The woods had a way of hiding things, and some things were better left undisturbed.